I had always imagined my wedding morning would be filled with butterflies, soft laughter, and the kind of joy that warms the bones. Yet when I opened my eyes that day, there was a weight in my chest I couldn't quite explain. The sunlight crept through the lace curtains, painting delicate golden patterns on the walls, as if the universe itself was blessing me. Evelyn, my best friend since childhood, and my maid of honor, had already brought in fresh flowers and coffee, fussing over every detail like she had been rehearsing this day alongside me. For a brief moment, I thought everything would go perfectly, just as I had dreamed. But then, across the room, leaning against the doorframe with arms crossed, was my sister Vivian, staring at me with eyes that held no warmth, just a strange, simmering bitterness. It was the kind of gaze that could cut deeper than words. Vivian and I had never been close, but I had hoped that at least on this day, the day I was to start a new life, we could put our differences aside. She was wearing a sleek navy blue dress that clung to her like armor, and I noticed she hadn't smiled once since arriving. Evelyn whispered something lighthearted about how I looked like a princess, trying to ease my nerves, but I could feel Vivian's eyes rolling from across the room. I wanted to ignore it, to push away the discomfort that pressed at my heart, yet my instincts told me she was here for something more than just watching me get married. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile as my reflection in the mirror revealed a trembling woman trying to disguise her fear. Daniel had sent me a message earlier that morning, and I had read it a dozen times already. No matter what happens today, remember, you're my home. You're my always. His words were like a rope keeping me from falling into the pit of unease Vivian's presence had stirred in me. I clung to them, repeating them silently, as Evelyn pinned the final curl into my hair and reminded me to breathe. Still, the tension in the room was thick, and Vivian's silence was louder than any insult she could have thrown. It was like a storm cloud waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to distract myself with the little details, how the satin of my gown shimmered in the light, how the faint scent of roses mixed with my perfume, how Evelyn hummed under her breath like she always did when she wanted to comfort me. But none of it could erase the sharp prickle on the back of my neck, the awareness that my sister was still standing there, watching, judging. It wasn't just dislike. It felt personal, almost venomous. I thought back to the night before when she had barely said a word at the rehearsal dinner, only smirking when Daniel toasted to our future. Something about that smirk had unsettled me. Vivian finally spoke, her voice low but cutting. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Scarlett. Not everything stays perfect forever." Her words hung in the air like smoke, choking the joy from the room. Evelyn froze mid-step, her eyes darting between us, unsure whether to intervene. I forced a small laugh, pretending it was nothing, but inside, my stomach knotted with dread. Why couldn't she just let me have this one day? Why did she always have to remind me that in her eyes, I was undeserving of happiness? Our mother, Margaret, entered just then, her face stern as always, and glanced at us both. She gave me a quick once-over, nodding approvingly, but her eyes lingered on Vivian with something harder to read. For a split second, I wondered if she too could sense the hostility radiating from my sister. Margaret had always been a woman of few words, but her presence was enough to silence the room. Still, the air didn't clear. It only thickened, and I felt myself suffocating under the weight of unspoken history. I remembered being little girls, dressing up in our mother's old gowns, pretending to marry princes and kings. Back then, Vivian had always insisted she play the bride, and I the bridesmaid. If I protested, she would tear the veil from my head and laugh until I cried. Those memories came flooding back now, uninvited, as if they had been hiding in the corners of my heart, waiting for this exact day to resurface. It was as though fate was circling back, reminding me of the roles we had been cast in long ago. But I wasn't that little girl anymore, and this was no game of dress-up. This was real. My hands trembled as Evelyn handed me the bouquet, its white roses trembling with me as though they too could sense the storm. Vivian gave a faint chuckle, almost inaudible, but sharp enough to pierce my chest. It was clear she was waiting for something, for the right moment to unleash whatever poison she had carried into this day. I just didn't know what it would be, or how much damage it could cause. I took a deep breath, lifted my chin, and whispered to myself that no one, not even my sister, could ruin the day I had waited for all my life. Yet, deep down, a shadow lingered, whispering otherwise, and as I locked eyes with Vivian one more time, I realized something chilling. This day was going to test me in ways I could never have imagined. The hours before the ceremony ticked by slowly, each minute pressing against me with the weight of memories I had spent years trying to bury. As I sat by the window, staring out at the garden where guests were beginning to arrive, I could feel Vivian's presence, even though she had stepped out. She lingered in the walls, in the silence, in the way my chest rose and fell too quickly. Evelyn tried to distract me by telling stories of her own wedding day, laughing about how she had forgotten her vows halfway through, but my mind kept drifting back to my sister. It was never just about dislike. It was something older, something born in the cradle of our childhood, a rivalry that no one ever properly named, but that I had lived inside like a prison cell for as long as I could remember. When we were children, Vivian had always been the one to demand attention. She was 3 years older, sharper, louder, the kind of girl who knew how to twist a room in her direction with little more than a glance. I, on the other hand, was quiet, observant, the shadow trailing behind her in every family portrait. Our mother, Margaret, had a strange way of feeding that imbalance, praising Vivian for her confidence while telling me I was sweet but fragile, as if fragility was all I could aspire to be. Those words stayed with me, carving cracks into my self-image, cracks Vivian loved to pry open with her taunts. It was always her game, make Scarlett feel small so she could feel bigger. And I played along, because I had no choice. There was one memory I could never shake, the day of my high school graduation. I had worked tirelessly for years, pouring myself into books, hoping for once that I could shine without being overshadowed. As I stood on the stage, diploma in hand, I searched the crowd for my family's faces. My father clapped with quiet pride, but my mother was already turned toward Vivian, who hadn't even graduated that year, whispering something that made them both laugh. Later that night, when I confronted Vivian about it, she shrugged and said, "You'll never outshine me, Scarlett. Don't even try." Those words had burned into me, and even now, on my wedding day, they rang like a prophecy I was desperate to defy. It would have been easier if Daniel hadn't been kind to her. Not romantically. He loved me in ways that Vivian could never imagine, but he had always treated her with respect, offering her a courtesy she didn't deserve. I often wondered if she mistook that kindness for interest, or if it simply enraged her that he saw value in me where she never had. I remembered a dinner a year ago, when Daniel had complimented the casserole I had made. Vivian had laughed cruelly, saying, "Of course you like it. Scarlett is desperate to feed people so they won't leave her." Daniel had smiled gently, defending me, but I caught a flicker in her eyes then, a dangerous mix of jealousy and hunger. Margaret always said sisters were supposed to be best friends, but ours was a battlefield where no peace treaty ever lasted. Vivian would slice me with words. I would retreat in silence. When she failed at something, she would drag me down with her, and when I achieved something, she made sure to diminish it. That morning, as I looked at my gown again in the mirror, I knew the dress wasn't just fabric to her. It was a symbol. It was me stepping into a light she could not tolerate, and she would rather shred it to pieces than let me walk proudly toward my happiness. The thought sent a chill crawling across my skin. Evelyn noticed my silence and placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice firm and steady. "Don't let her get in your head, Scar. Today is about you and Daniel, no one else." Her words were true, but they didn't erase the ache inside me, the ache of years spent battling for air in a house where my existence was always second place. I nodded, forcing a smile, but my hands were trembling so badly that Evelyn had to steady the bouquet once more. If only she knew how deep the roots of this rivalry ran, how Vivian had been preparing to ruin this moment long before today. I glanced at the clock, 1/2 an hour until the ceremony. My stomach twisted into knots, and I couldn't help but remember my father, Robert, who had passed 2 years earlier. He had been the only one who seemed to understand me, the only one who whispered late at night, "Don't believe everything your sister says, Scar. You're stronger than you think." His absence today felt like a hollow wound. I knew that if he were alive, Vivian would not dare step so close to destroying me. Without him, though, I felt like a lamb cornered by a wolf, and still, I held on to his voice, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to prove I was not fragile anymore. The murmur of guests outside grew louder, laughter drifting into the room like a reminder of the life awaiting me beyond these walls. And yet, I could not shake the certainty that something was coming, that Vivian's silence, her smirk, her words earlier, were all preludes to the act she had been rehearsing in her mind for years. I didn't know what form it would take, but I knew with every beat of my racing heart that she wouldn't leave this day untouched. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I would finally stop running from her. The knock on the door was sharp, almost violent, breaking through the calm Evelyn had tried to build around me. She moved to answer it, but before her hand reached the knob, the door swung open, and Vivian stood there, framed by the light of the hallway like some specter who had been waiting for her cue. She didn't smile, not at first. Her eyes darted to my dress, lingering on the intricate lace at the bodice, the veil cascading down my shoulders. Then, slowly, her lips curled into that familiar smirk, the one she wore whenever she was about to do something she knew would wound me. My breath caught in my throat, a warning that arrived too late, because she had already stepped forward, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Scarlet," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "You actually think you look beautiful?" The words were poison, but it was her laugh that chilled me to the bone. Loud, cruel, echoing in the small room like the cackle of a villain in a play. Evelyn bristled, stepping between us, but Vivian shoved her aside without effort. She came closer, fingers grazing the fabric of my gown, pretending to admire it. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, because I knew her too well. Her eyes weren't admiring, they were calculating, weighing the destruction in her hands like a wolf considering the neck of its prey. Then it happened. With one vicious tug, she seized the delicate lace at my waist and yanked. The sound was deafening, a rip so loud it seemed to slice through the air, through my chest, through the fragile bubble of hope I had built around myself. I gasped, staggering back, hands flying to the torn fabric, but it was useless. Vivian laughed, a deep, satisfied laugh as she tore again, harder, ripping the satin along the seam until the once perfect gown sagged and frayed in her fists. Evelyn screamed, grabbing for her arms, but Vivian shoved her off, intoxicated by the chaos she had created. "You look ridiculous," she sneered, holding up a shredded piece of my veil like a trophy. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might shatter. Tears burned behind my eyes, blurring the vision of my once flawless gown now hanging in tatters. For a moment I couldn't breathe. All I could hear was her laughter. All I could feel was the sting of humiliation, the years of cruelty condensed into this single, unforgivable act. I wanted to collapse, to disappear, to curl into myself like the fragile girl she had always claimed I was. But something inside me, something buried for years, began to stir. Evelyn rushed to my side, her hands trembling as she tried to hold the fabric together, whispering frantically that it could be fixed, that there was still time. But I knew it couldn't. The damage wasn't just to the dress, it was to everything I had dreamed this day would be. The gown had been my armor, the proof that I was stepping into a new life, radiant and untouchable. Vivian hadn't just torn fabric. She had tried to tear away my dignity, my confidence, my chance to stand tall before the world. And yet, as I looked into the mirror and saw my reflection, broken dress, tear-stained cheeks, eyes blazing with something unfamiliar, I realized she hadn't won. Not yet. Vivian must have seen it too, because her smirk faltered for the briefest moment. She tilted her head, as if confused by my silence, expecting me to scream or crumble. That was the role I had always played, the fragile sister who absorbed the blows in silence. But now, standing there in shredded silk, I felt my father's voice echo in my memory. "You're stronger than you think." The words pulsed through me, steadying my breath. I wasn't fragile anymore. I couldn't be, not if I wanted to survive her. Evelyn looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, waiting for me to collapse into her arms. Instead, I straightened, smoothing the torn fabric as best I could, and lifted my chin. My hands still shook, but my voice when it came was calm, deliberate, and sharp as glass. "If you think this ruins me, Vivian," I said, staring directly into her eyes, "then you don't know me at all." The silence that followed was electric, heavy with the weight of 100 unspoken battles. Vivian's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of uncertainty now, a crack in the armor she wore so well. For the first time, I didn't shrink beneath her cruelty. I didn't hide my tears or my trembling hands. I stood in the wreckage of what she had tried to destroy, and felt something shift inside me. My gown was ruined, yes, but maybe, just maybe, I could walk out there and show everyone that I was more than a victim of my sister's envy. The idea scared me, thrilled me, and burned in my chest like a spark refusing to die. Vivian had torn my dress, but she had also torn open a part of me I had kept buried, the part that refused to let her write the ending to my story. Evelyn's hands shook as she tried to pin the torn lace back together, whispering broken reassurances through her tears. "We'll fix it, Scarlett. We'll sew it, hide it, something. Just don't go out there like this." Her voice cracked with desperation, but I barely heard her. My reflection in the mirror held me captive, the shredded fabric dangling like wounds across my body, my face pale and wet with tears, my hair trembling under the weight of the veil. I had always imagined myself radiant, untouchable on this day, but instead, I looked raw, exposed, like the little girl who had never been enough in Vivian's eyes. And still, beneath that fragile exterior, something unyielding flickered like a hidden flame. Vivian lingered near the doorway, arms folded, watching me crumble with satisfaction. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was a weapon sharper than her words. Every second that passed, she looked more triumphant, as if she had already won, as if she had proven that I would never escape her shadow. Evelyn glared at her, hissing for her to leave, but Vivian ignored her, savoring the moment like a cat toying with its prey. My chest tightened with fury, my pulse roaring in my ears. I could let her have this victory, sink into the floor, send the guests home, hide my shame, or I could rise, even if I looked like a disaster doing it. The thought terrified me. To walk into that hall, to face Daniel in the crowd, to show myself in a dress ruined by cruelty, it was madness. People would whisper, laugh, pity me. They would see the torn silk and assume the bride was broken too. My knees trembled just imagining it, the weight of 100 eyes burning into me. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the fear wash over me, let it drown me like it always had. But then my father's voice rose again in my memory, soft but firm, a lifeline through the chaos. "Scarlett, strength isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when you're broken." The words struck deep. Maybe this was what he meant. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and looked at Evelyn, who still clutched the ruined fabric with trembling fingers. "Stop," I whispered. She froze, staring at me in confusion. I stood taller, shoulders back, and took a shaky breath. "Don't fix it. Don't hide it." My words startled even me, but the conviction behind them grew as I spoke. "I'm going out there like this." Evelyn's eyes widened in horror, her lips parting to protest. But something in my face must have told her I was serious. For the first time, I wasn't asking to be saved. I was choosing my own way forward, no matter how frightening it was. Vivian's smirk faltered again, the tiniest twitch at the corner of her mouth betraying her confusion. She had expected tears, defeat, maybe even rage, but not this. Never this. I could see her calculating, scrambling to predict what would happen if I carried this ruined dress into the crowd. Would they mock me, or would they see her fingerprints all over the destruction? For once, she wasn't in control, and the uncertainty unsettled her. A flicker of satisfaction coursed through me, warming my chest in defiance of the cold terror that still gripped me. Evelyn grasped my hands, her voice breaking. "Scarlett, you don't have to prove anything. Don't let her ruin this." I squeezed her hands gently, grateful for her love, but I shook my head. "This isn't about her anymore. This is about me." My voice trembled, but the truth in it rang clear. All my life, I had been defined by Vivian's cruelty, my worth measured against her venom. But not today. Today, I would walk down that aisle, not in perfection, but in defiance, wearing the evidence of survival instead of a mask of flawlessness. I turned to the door, my heart hammering so hard it rattled my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to hide, to protect myself, but I moved forward anyway, each step heavier than the last, as if I were carrying not just a ruined dress, but the weight of every insult, every wound, every scar she had given me. Vivian stepped aside, letting me pass, her eyes narrowing as though she couldn't quite believe what I was about to do. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. If I faltered now, everything would crumble. So I walked. When I reached the threshold of the hall, the music swelled, and every head turned. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave, eyes widening at the sight of the bride in tatters. My breath hitched, but I lifted my chin, forcing my gaze to lock onto Daniel at the altar. His face was stunned, yes, but not with disgust. There was something else there, something fierce and tender that I clung to like a lifeline. And in that moment, despite the laughter I half expected to erupt, despite the whispers already spreading, I knew I had done the unthinkable. I had chosen to be seen exactly as I was, broken and unbowed. The first gasp echoed like thunder, then multiplied into a storm of murmurs that filled the entire hall. I could feel every eye clawing at me, dissecting me, trying to make sense of the bride who dared to walk toward her wedding in a shredded dress. My legs trembled with each step, but I forced myself to move steadily, refusing to let the tremor of fear betray me. The torn fabric brushed against my skin like a reminder of Vivian's cruelty, but also like armor forged from survival. I lifted my chin higher, though my cheeks burned crimson with shame, pretending I couldn't hear the hisses and whispers spilling from the rows of guests. "Is this some kind of joke?" one voice muttered. "Poor thing," another whispered, pity dripping from every syllable. Pity. It stung more than laughter ever could. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Vivian, who had followed me in, slipping gracefully into a front row seat as though she were nothing but an innocent spectator. Her smirk was subtle but undeniable, her gaze flicking between the guests as she gauged their reactions. This was her stage too, and she was already rewriting the script in her mind, ready to paint me as unhinged, dramatic, incapable of holding myself together even on my wedding day. I focused on Daniel. His eyes had widened the moment I appeared, his hand tightening around the edge of the altar as though he needed to anchor himself. For one horrible heartbeat, I thought I saw disappointment there, that maybe he too would think I was ridiculous. My chest seized, but then his expression softened, his lips parting in a breathless kind of awe. He wasn't looking at the ruined dress. He was looking at me, really looking, as if this torn, trembling version of me was somehow more real than the pristine bride he had imagined. A lump rose in my throat. Behind me, Vivian finally made her move. Her voice carried just loud enough for the guests around her to hear, though it was coated in feigned sympathy. "She panicked, poor thing," she said with a delicate shake of her head. "Scarlett has always been fragile. I tried to calm her down, but..." Her pause was calculated, her eyes shining with false concern, as she let the implication hang heavy. Gasps and whispers rippled again, some guests nodding as though the story fit too neatly with the scene before them. My fists clenched at my sides. She was trying to make my strength look like madness. I reached the altar steps, my heart hammering, when Daniel moved. He stepped down, closing the space between us with deliberate, steady strides. Silence fell across the room, as if everyone held their breath at once. When he reached me, he didn't flinch at the sight of the torn silk. Instead, he touched my cheek, his thumb brushing away the last traces of tears. His voice, low but firm, carried across the hall. "You're beautiful." That was all he said, yet the weight of it silenced 100 murmurs in an instant. My knees nearly buckled. He saw me, not the ruin, not the shame. Me. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some guests frowned, glancing toward Vivian as if suddenly questioning the cracks in her story. Others looked at Daniel, their faces softening with admiration, drawn into the undeniable sincerity of his gesture. For the first time, the tide seemed to pause, uncertain which way to turn. I could almost feel Vivian's pulse quickening, her perfectly constructed control slipping grain by grain, her lips pressed together, a faint crack in her mask of composure. She had expected me to crumble, for Daniel to recoil, but instead, he had chosen me, torn dress and all. Still, whispers lingered, snaking through the silence like smoke. What happened to her dress? Did she do it herself? No. Look at Vivian's face. She knows something. Every word was a spark, threatening to ignite into full suspicion. I could see it, the shifting eyes, the nervous glances toward my sister. The truth wasn't spoken yet, but it was beginning to pulse beneath the surface. Vivian's calculated image of superiority was fraying, just like the gown she had torn. The difference was, my ruin had turned into resilience, while hers was morphing into something uglier. Exposure. I tightened my grip on Daniel's hand as he guided me up the final step, his presence a shield against the storm of eyes and whispers. My chest still ached with fear, but also with a new kind of fire, one that refused to let Vivian dictate the story any longer. This wasn't the spectacle she had planned. It was something she couldn't control, and that realization was written in the subtle twitch of her jaw as she sat among the guests, no longer the silent victor, but a woman cornered. The crowd hadn't turned fully against her yet, but the cracks were there, widening with each heartbeat, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything shattered. For a fleeting moment, the silence in the hall felt like a fragile truce, delicate, trembling, threatening to collapse at the smallest push. And then Vivian provided that push. She rose slowly from her seat, her movements deliberate, as though she were a queen ascending her throne. All eyes turned to her, as if instinctively aware that she was about to seize the stage. Her voice, soft at first, carried just enough strain to sound convincing. "She wasn't supposed to come out like this," Vivian said, clutching her pearls dramatically. "Scarlet, she wasn't ready." I tried to protect her from humiliating herself, but she let her words trail off, like a martyr suffering silently. The audience shifted in their seats, torn between curiosity and doubt. My breath hitched. She was doing it again, painting herself as the savior, the good sister burdened with the weight of my supposed fragility. Anger welled inside me, but I forced myself to stand taller, refusing to cower. "That's not true," I said firmly, though my voice trembled at the edges. Every gaze snapped back to me, the torn dress clinging to my skin as a raw testament of what she had done. My pulse thudded in my ears. For the first time in my life, I realized this wasn't just about a ruined wedding dress. It was about years of silence, of swallowing her cruelty, and letting her rewrite the narrative. I would not let her win again. Vivian turned her head toward me, her eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before she rearranged her face into concern. "Scarlet, please," she said sweetly. "You're overwhelmed. Everyone here can see that. The pressure, the dress, the crowd. It's too much for you. It's always been too much for you." The venom in her words was wrapped in silk, but the bite was sharp enough to pierce my heart. I clenched Daniel's hand tighter, grounding myself. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He stood beside me like a wall, his presence a constant reminder that I wasn't alone anymore. The guests whispered furiously, some nodding in uneasy agreement with Vivian, others frowning at her tone. A middle-aged aunt I barely recognized leaned forward, her eyes darting between us as if she were piecing together a puzzle she hadn't realized existed. The atmosphere thickened with tension, the air itself heavy with expectation. I could see the doubt creeping into their eyes, not just about me, but about Vivian too. She had overplayed her hand. Her words were too rehearsed, too practiced. And when something is rehearsed, people start to wonder what's being hidden behind the performance. Daniel finally spoke, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the growing fog of suspicion. "Enough, Vivian." The authority in his tone startled even me. The hall quieted instantly, all ears straining to hear his words. "You don't get to humiliate Scarlet today. Not here, not ever again." His words cracked through the silence like a whip, and gasps rippled across the crowd. Vivian's face twitched, her mask slipping just enough for the audience to catch a glimpse of the fury boiling underneath. I had never seen her cornered before, and now it was happening in front of everyone. She tried to laugh, but the sound was brittle, jagged, like glass breaking. "Humiliate her?" she repeated, her voice rising with feigned disbelief. "Scarlet is humiliating herself. Look at her." She gestured toward my torn dress, her hands sweeping dramatically. "She insists on walking down the aisle like this, like a spectacle." I begged her to change, to take a moment to compose herself, but she refused, and now everyone must witness her breakdown. Her voice cracked, but it was too late. The more she insisted, the more desperate she sounded. The guests were no longer just listening. They were studying her, scrutinizing every word, every twitch, every strained smile. A strange calm began to spread through me. For the first time, I realized Vivian wasn't untouchable. She was flailing, trapped in her own web of lies. And as I stood there, torn dress and all, I was the proof she couldn't erase. "Vivian tore my dress," I said suddenly, my voice loud and clear. A hush fell, every whisper strangled into silence. My words hung in the air like a blade, cutting clean through the tension. I felt the heat of every gaze on me, but I didn't falter. She came into my room before the ceremony and ripped it apart. "That's the truth," the crowd erupted, gasps and murmurs bouncing like wildfire. Vivian froze, her lips parting as though she had been struck across the face. "That's absurd," she spat, the sweetness vanishing from her voice in an instant. "Why would I ever do such a thing? She's lying. Can't you all see? She's making me the villain because she can't handle her own emotions." But her protests only deepened the suspicion. The more she fought, the more frantic she appeared, her carefully constructed image unraveling before the very people she had always sought to impress. For once, the weight of doubt was no longer crushing me. It was crushing her. I looked at the sea of faces, their eyes darting between Vivian and me, between the torn fabric of my gown and the venom spilling from her lips. And for the first time, I felt something shift, not just in the crowd, but inside me. I wasn't just the bride in the ruined dress anymore. I was the woman who dared to speak, the sister who had finally stopped letting silence protect cruelty. And as Vivian's mask cracked under the pressure, I knew the battle wasn't over yet. But for the first time in my life, I felt the possibility of victory. The moment the words left my lips, Vivian tore my dress. The room seemed to stop breathing. For one suspended heartbeat, no one moved, no one blinked, as though every guest had been frozen in their seat. Then the murmurs began again, louder this time, buzzing like hornets, stinging the air with disbelief and curiosity. Vivian's chest rose and fell too quickly, her eyes darting from face to face, searching desperately for an ally. But the calm mask she had worn all her life was cracking under the heat of exposure. I saw it in the twitch of her jaw, in the way her hands clenched at her sides. The predator realizing that the crowd she used to control was slipping away. Her laugh came sharp, hollow, echoing against the walls of the hall. "Scarlet," she said, her voice dripping venom now. No sweetness left. "You've always been dramatic. Ever since we were children, you've twisted everything to make yourself the victim. And now, here you are, trying to ruin my reputation on your wedding day." The words struck like darts, but this time, I didn't crumble. I stood taller, the torn dress against my skin suddenly feeling like armor instead of shame. Around us, people leaned forward, eyes narrowing at Vivian's tone. She had lost the pity, and what remained in her voice was unmistakable bitterness. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Vivian and me, his stance protective, his presence commanding. "This isn't about reputation, Vivian," he said, his voice ringing with steel. "It's about what you did. You can't hide it anymore. Everyone here can see the truth." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of conviction. I squeezed his hand, silently thanking him for being the shield I had never had in my family. For the first time, Vivian didn't have the power to isolate me. Together, Daniel and I were dismantling her script, piece by piece. Vivian's composure snapped. She lunged forward, her voice shrill, her face contorted with fury. "You think you're better than me, Scarlet? You've always thought that. But you're nothing. Nothing!" The words cut through the hall like lightning, leaving the crowd stunned into silence. A child in the back whimpered, and even that small sound seemed to punctuate the ugliness of her outburst. My chest tightened, not from her insult, but from the realization that the monster I had endured in private was finally standing fully exposed for everyone to see. And there was no going back from that. The guests began whispering again, but this time the whispers were tinged with disgust. An elderly aunt shook her head in disbelief, muttering to the woman beside her, "No sister talks that way on such a day." A young cousin leaned closer to his friend and whispered audibly, "She's unhinged." Vivian heard it. Of course she did. And her face flushed crimson, her eyes blazing as she tried to snarl her way back into control. But the more she fought, the more she lost. Every word she hurled now dug her hole deeper, stripping away the polished persona she had carefully curated for years. "I sacrificed everything for her," Vivian screeched, her voice breaking. "I gave up my own happiness, and this is how she repays me? By humiliating me in front of everyone?" She clasped her chest theatrically, tears springing into her eyes. But the performance no longer landed. Instead of sympathy, the crowd gave her blank stares, arms crossed, lips pressed tight in judgment. Her act was unraveling before her, and she knew it. The desperation in her eyes betrayed the truth. She wasn't protecting me. She was protecting herself. I felt a strange calmness settle over me, as though the storm had passed inside my chest. My fear was gone, replaced by clarity. I turned to the guests, my voice steady, no longer trembling. "This isn't the first time Vivian has tried to ruin me. She spent years belittling me, tearing me down, making sure I never felt good enough. Today, she tried to do it again. But I won't let her succeed. Not anymore." My words weren't shouted, but they echoed louder than Vivian's shrieks. They were the truth, simple and undeniable, and the crowd responded with a wave of murmurs that carried weight and sympathy. Vivian's face twisted into something I could barely recognize. Gone was the charming sister, the golden girl everyone had admired. In her place stood the jealous, furious woman who could not tolerate my happiness. Her mask had shattered completely, and the shards lay scattered across the floor for everyone to see. For years, she had convinced the world that I was fragile, dependent, inferior. But now, with one public eruption, she had destroyed her own illusion. And as I looked at her trembling, red-faced figure, I realized something shocking. This wasn't the end of her downfall. This was only the beginning. The silence that followed my words seemed to suffocate the hall, a thick and heavy quiet where even the air felt charged. Vivian's chest heaved as she searched for a way back into control, her lips trembling with fury. Then, in a voice sharp as glass, she spat, "If you think Scarlet is some innocent bride, then all of you are blind. Do you want to know the truth about her? Because I've been holding it back for years." Gasps rippled through the crowd, people leaning forward in morbid curiosity. My stomach tightened. I had no idea what she was about to say, but I knew it wouldn't be anything kind. Vivian's eyes glittered with malice, ready to drop a bomb that she believed would destroy me. She drew in a shaky breath, her hands raised like an actress on stage about to reveal her final line. "Scarlet isn't the perfect daughter you all think she is. She's weak, pathetic, and—" Her voice cracked with venom, but then she smiled cruelly. "When she was in college, she begged me to cover for her because she almost failed out. She couldn't handle the pressure. So who do you think wrote her essays? Who do you think kept her from humiliating herself even then?" She looked around triumphantly, expecting the audience to gasp in judgment at me. But instead the room remained eerily still. Her secret hung in the air, hollow and bitter, exposing more of her cruelty than my supposed weakness. Daniel stepped closer, his hand brushing mine, grounding me. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed Vivian. "Do you hear yourself? You're boasting about tearing her down over grades, over mistakes from years ago. Do you think that makes you noble? Or does it only show how much you've resented her success since the beginning?" His words landed like stones, and several heads in the audience nodded in agreement. What Vivian thought was a fatal revelation now seemed pitiful, petty, and desperate. She had taken her last swing, but instead of striking me, she struck her own credibility. Vivian's smile faltered as murmurs spread like wildfire. "That's it?" Someone whispered loudly from the second row, incredulous. "She almost failed school? Who hasn't struggled?" Another voice joined in, sharper this time. "So you kept that over her head all these years? That's not love. That's cruelty." Vivian's face flushed deep red, her eyes darting wildly as if searching for one person, just one, who would defend her. But the silence of loyalty was deafening. One by one, her supposed admirers lowered their gazes, refusing to offer her the validation she craved. Panic flickered across her face, and then she raised her voice again, desperate. "You don't understand. I saved her. Without me, she would have been nothing. She would have failed. She would have embarrassed all of you, our family, our name. I did what I had to do to protect her." But the more she insisted, the less convincing she sounded. People had already seen through her mask in the last chapter, and now, with each frantic word, she was digging a grave no one would climb into with her. Her defense revealed not sacrifice, but obsession, control disguised as love. I felt a strength surge in me, not from anger this time, but from clarity. Stepping forward, I faced Vivian directly, my torn dress trailing softly across the floor. "Do you hear yourself, Vivian?" My voice trembled only slightly, but it carried. "You call it saving me, but it was never about helping. It was about control. You wanted me small, indebted to you, always reminded of my flaws so you could feel powerful. But I'm done letting you hold my mistakes over my head. I'm not ashamed of them anymore." My words broke free like chains falling from my wrists, and in the silence that followed, I felt lighter than I ever had before. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in quiet applause that spread like a wave. It wasn't the thunder of celebration, but the gentle, approving sound of people acknowledging truth, of siding with dignity over cruelty. A few even rose to their feet, their faces resolute, as if making a choice. Daniel looked at me with pride, his eyes shining with something unspoken, but powerful. "You've won." Vivian's expression crumbled at the sound, her lips quivering as she realized the truth. Her final weapon had failed. The applause wasn't for her, and it never would be again. Vivian's knees seemed to buckle slightly, and for the first time, she looked small, diminished under the weight of her own fury. She opened her mouth as if to speak again, but no words came, only a shallow gasp as though she were choking on the silence of her lost power. I didn't need to say anything more. The crowd had turned decisively. Daniel was at my side, and my torn dress had become a symbol, not of humiliation, but of resilience. The sister who had spent years shadowing me had finally destroyed herself with her own hand, and as the applause swelled louder, I realized that this day, though scarred, was finally becoming mine again. The applause swelled into something almost surreal, echoing in the hall like the sound of judgment passed. For years, I had carried Vivian's shadow like a weight across my shoulders. But in that moment, I felt it lift as the crowd stood with me. My hands trembled, not from fear anymore, but from the rush of release. I glanced at Daniel, who squeezed my fingers with quiet certainty, anchoring me in the storm. His eyes were steady, telling me without words that this day was still ours, that her cruelty had no power left. For the first time since she tore my dress, I let myself breathe deeply, and it tasted like freedom. The officiant, who had stood frozen during the entire confrontation, cleared his throat softly as if trying to bring the ceremony back to life. There was an almost hesitant energy among the guests, like they weren't sure if we could simply continue after so much chaos. But Daniel, always braver than me, took a step forward and lifted my hand high. "This is the woman I love," he declared, his voice breaking through the tension. "No dress, no scandal, no cruelty will ever change that. And today, I'm marrying her." The crowd erupted into cheers. Not polite clapping this time, but genuine, heartfelt shouts that melted the lingering discomfort. Vivian stood rigid at the side, her eyes darting wildly as if the room had betrayed her. The louder they cheered for us, the more she shrank. Her lips curled into a thin, bitter line, her fists clenched at her sides. But she said nothing. It was as though the applause itself struck her harder than any words ever could. She had sought to humiliate me, to control the story, but instead, the story had slipped through her hands, leaving her exposed. She looked like an actress who had forgotten her lines while the audience turned away, and that, perhaps, was the cruelest punishment of all. The officiant spoke again, and this time people leaned in, eager to witness what they had come for, not destruction, but union. My heart pounded as Daniel and I exchanged vows, our voices quivering but strong, words spoken not just to each other but to everyone in the room, that love endures, that resilience matters more than perfection, that we could stand in the face of sabotage and still choose joy. When Daniel slid the ring onto my finger, I heard sniffles in the audience, genuine tears replacing the earlier shock. My torn dress, once a mark of humiliation, now looked like a battle scar of survival. I didn't dare look at Vivian until the final words rang out. "You may now kiss the bride." As Daniel's lips met mine, the hall erupted in cheers again, louder, brighter, unstoppable. It was in that noise, in that sea of joy, that I finally turned my head and saw her. Vivian's face was pale with fury, her jaw trembling as she realized she was no longer the center. For once she had no audience, no applause, no spotlight. She turned sharply, the hem of her dress whipping against the floor, and stormed toward the doors. The crowd parted instinctively, not with fear but with dismissal, as though she had become irrelevant. But as she reached the exit, she stopped and spun around, her eyes blazing. "Don't think this is over," she shouted, her voice slicing through the celebration. The sudden venom silenced the cheers for a heartbeat, leaving a ripple of unease. My stomach clenched. Even in her defeat, Vivian couldn't let go. Her words weren't a concession, but a warning, a promise that she would carry this grudge beyond today. For a moment, the shadows of her threat loomed over me, reminding me that some battles never truly end. Daniel stepped in front of me, shielding me with his presence as if instinctively. His voice was calm, steady, and unshaken. "It is over, Vivian, not because you say so, but because we've stopped letting you control us. Whatever you do next, it won't work. Not anymore." His words weren't just for her. They were for me, too, and for everyone watching. Slowly, the unease faded, replaced by murmurs of agreement. People turned their backs on Vivian, literally shifting away, showing her with their silence that she no longer held any sway. That, more than anything, shattered her. She stood frozen for a long, agonizing second, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. And then, with one final glare, she wrenched open the doors and vanished into the night. The heavy slam of wood against wood echoed like the closing of a chapter, leaving the air clearer than before. I exhaled shakily, leaning into Daniel's arms, and the crowd erupted again, this time louder, purer, unshaken by her threat. My wedding had been scarred, yes, but it had also been reclaimed. I wasn't the broken bride she had hoped for. I was stronger, braver, and no longer afraid of her shadow. The hall had quieted into a gentle hum of conversation, soft laughter and relieved sighs filling the space. Guests lingered, some approaching us to offer congratulations, others whispering in awe about the drama they had witnessed. I felt the weight of adrenaline still clinging to my body, my chest tight but steady, my hands warm in Daniel's grip. My torn dress had survived intact, a living testament to resilience, and somehow, in its imperfection, it looked regal. People smiled at me, genuinely this time, seeing not just the bride, but the woman who had refused to be humiliated, the sister who had finally reclaimed her own story. Daniel leaned close and whispered, "You were incredible." His voice trembled with emotion, and for a moment I let myself cry, not from sorrow, but from the release of every pent-up fear and frustration. The guests who had seen Vivian's outburst began to talk openly now, some shaking their heads at her cruelty, others praising my courage. I realized then that the power Vivian had wielded for years wasn't inherent. It was borrowed from fear and silence, and today, in front of everyone, that borrowed power had evaporated, leaving her exposed and alone. I caught sight of Vivian briefly, standing outside the window with the night wrapping around her like a shroud. Her face was pale, her hands pressed to the glass as if she could reach through and reclaim the control she had lost. There was a flash of something unspoken in her eyes, a mix of rage, disbelief, and perhaps, in some hidden corner, regret. But the moment passed quickly. I had no intention of watching her spiral any longer. My wedding was mine again, and I would not let her shadow darken it one more second. The officiant approached, offering a small, knowing smile. "You handled that with remarkable grace," he said quietly. "It's rare to see someone reclaim their day in such a way." I nodded, still catching my breath, and allowed myself a small, triumphant smile. This was more than a wedding. It was the culmination of years of endurance. Every insult, every petty attack, every tear I had swallowed. Tonight, I had won far more than just a marriage ceremony. I had won my dignity, my voice, and finally, the recognition that I could stand tall no matter what my sister tried to take from me. The guests continued to celebrate, moving between the cake, the dance floor, and the quiet corners to share their admiration. I felt a new sense of freedom with every smile, every nod of approval. Daniel never let go of my hand, his presence a solid grounding force that reminded me of everything we had overcome together. And though Vivian's shadow still lingered somewhere in the night, I knew it no longer held any sway over me. Her cruelty had failed, and my resilience had won. The room, filled with laughter and light, felt like a sanctuary finally reclaimed. As the evening wore on, whispers of Vivian's outburst spread even further, reaching corners of the family who hadn't attended the ceremony. Some called her behavior scandalous, others simply shook their heads in pity. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted, permanently and irrevocably. People were seeing her as she truly was, not the perfect, polished sister she had always pretended to be, but a woman consumed by envy and fear, powerless against the strength of someone she had tried to destroy, and that realization was more satisfying than any applause could ever be. Later, alone with Daniel, I allowed myself to reflect quietly on the storm that had passed. My dress was torn, my nerves frayed, but my spirit was unbroken. I realized something fundamental. No act of cruelty, no sibling's attempt to dominate, could define me anymore. I had faced the humiliation head-on, refused to hide, and in doing so, I had changed the narrative. Vivian's shadow no longer loomed over my life. I had stepped into the light, carrying scars that had become badges of courage. Tonight wasn't just a wedding, it was my emancipation. And yet, somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't ignore the faint echo of her words as she left. "Don't think this is over." I knew the path ahead might still be tangled with tension, perhaps even new schemes, but I no longer feared them. I had learned how to rise above cruelty, how to reclaim what was mine, and how to stand with dignity no matter the storm. I glanced at Daniel, and together we stepped into the future, hand in hand, hearts full, unafraid. Vivian's shadow had lost. I had won. The night was ours.